Welcome to Group 5's presentation. This presentation was compiled by Eureka Whedon, Davita Washington, Latoya Stevenson, Star Stokes, and myself, Laura Thompson. Today's presentation is entitled Preventing Sexual Harassment in the Workplace, and I want to welcome you to this presentation. Before we get started, I want to give you just a little bit of information. First of all, if you have any questions that you want to ask as we're going along, please raise your hand. Feel free to ask them. I'm hoping that we'll have a good bit of discussion today. I like an interactive session, so please feel free to participate. Also, again, my name is Laura Thompson, and I'm an administrative specialist with this company. I've been doing these presentations for several years, and so I've heard a lot of things, but I haven't heard everything. So again, if you have questions, please don't hesitate to ask them. Also, you should have received when you walked in today the participants guide. In the back of this guide is a quiz that we'll be taking at the end of the presentation to evaluate your knowledge and what you learned today. We'll also, after that, is an evaluation of myself as a presenter, and I appreciate any feedback that you can give me on this presentation. So let's go ahead and get started. The first thing we're going to talk about today is today's training objectives, and there are 5 of them. The first objective, of course, is to be able to define sexual harassment. It's hard to know what sexual harassment is and how to prevent it if you don't know what it is. The second thing we're going to do is to identify the types and examples of sexual harassment. And the third thing that we're going to do is explain the procedures for reporting sexual harassment incidents. After that, we're going to describe what supervisors or management's responsibility is, and so you'll be able to identify management's responsibilities to prevent, recognize, and respond to sexual harassment. And then finally, the 5th objective is to identify employees' responsibilities to prevent, recognize, and respond to sexual harassment. Now, you might be asking yourself why it's important that you're in this sexual harassment or preventing sexual harassment presentation. And it's because sexual harassment is a serious issue. It's a form of discrimination, and it's against the law. So those are all things that we need to be aware of and help prevent. Penalties can also be very expensive, both for the company and personally. Injunctions, back pay, front pay, litigation costs, and compensatory and punitive damages are all different types of financial costs that can be associated with sexual harassment. So I know I don't want to have to pay someone else compensatory and punitive damages, and I don't want the company to also find itself in a situation where it's having to pay for my mistake if I were to sexually harass someone. So that's why it's important to know what sexual harassment is. Okay, so let's get started with our first objective, which again is to define sexual harassment and to describe sexual harassment policy. All right, the definition of sexual harassment, which is from the EEOC, is that harassment is the basis of harassment on the basis of sex is a violation of Section 703 of Title VII, which is part of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Unwelcome sexual advances, requests for sexual favors, and other verbal or physical conduct of a sexual nature constitutes sexual harassment when submission of the conduct is made explicitly or implicitly a term of condition to the individual's employment, submission to or reflection of such conduct by an individual is used as a basis for employment decisions, or 3, such conduct has the purpose or effect of unreasonably interfering with the individual's work performance, creating an intimidating, hostile, or offensive work environment. So as you can see, to kind of recap that, sexual harassment is unwelcome sexual advances, requests for sexual favors, and or verbal, visual, or physical conduct of a sexual nature. And the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, or EEOC, is the one that oversees sexual harassment claims. And it is a criminal activity that can have serious legal repercussions for both the individual and the organization, as I talked about earlier. Sexual harassment policy is that sexual harassment, when it occurs between a supervisor and a subordinate or co-workers, cannot and will not be tolerated by this company. We have a zero tolerance policy here for sexual harassment. So please keep that in mind when you observe it. I'm sure none of you are going to participate in it, but definitely if you observe it, and we'll talk more about that later, about reporting it, so on. Okay, more about organizational policies for sexual harassment. The company has two policies that I want to make you aware of. First, personal relationships. The company does permit socializing and friendships among employees, but it prohibits personal relationships between supervisors and their direct reports. So it's important to keep that in mind when you are thinking about how cute your supervisor is, that you should not be dating your supervisor, okay? Also, sexual harassment of customers and clients is also something to consider. Unwelcome sexual advances, requests for sexual favors, and other verbal or physical contact of a sexual nature is strictly prohibited with regards to customers or clients as well. So if you're a salesperson and you have that nice looking young lady come in, you can smile at her, but no inviting her out to dinner. That is prohibited. Okay, we have this, I love this little picture here with the two co-workers. Obviously they are not sexually harassing each other, and it looks like they are not supervisor and subordinate, so that would be okay. But now we're going to move on to objective 2, which is identify types and examples of sexual harassment. And again, if you have any questions, please feel free to stop me at any time. Okay, types of sexual harassment. There's really two main types of sexual harassment. Later there'll be examples, but there's two main types of sexual harassment. And the first is quid pro quo, which is a Latin term. It means this for that. And an example of quid pro quo sexual harassment would be if your supervisor promises to give you a promotion if you'll sleep with him. That would be a quid pro quo sexual harassment. If you, which is a promise in exchange for a favor, or I'll do this for you when dealing with job benefits, okay? So that's something we definitely don't want to do. The second type, I think, is probably a lot more common in today's work environment, and that is the hostile work environment. And that is a workplace in which unwelcome conduct of a sexual nature occurs, and it creates an uncomfortable working environment for some employees. I have a personal example from my sister, actually, to share with you. My sister works in an office as well, and she has a coworker that loves to come in on Monday morning and share her stories of her sexual escapades over the weekend. And this actually really makes my sister uncomfortable. So if she did this long term and without stopping, even if she was asked, this would be an example of creating a hostile work environment. We'll talk more about the reporting of it and what employees need to do in a minute, but I just wanted to kind of give you an example. I also wanted to point out that unlike quid pro quo sexual harassment, which can occur from just one single incident, kind of like in this picture where you've got the boss who looks like he was slapped for touching his secretary's rear end, in hostile work environment, it's generally something that can be found over the long term or in severe instances. Probably some of you are too young to remember the tailhook scandal with the military many years ago. But that was kind of an example of a long-term or severe incident of sexual harassment. Okay, now we're going to talk about the different forms of sexual harassment. There are 3 basic forms of sexual harassment. The first is verbal, and that includes things like sexual windows, suggestive comments, jokes of a sexual nature, sexual propositions, or sexual threats. The second would be nonverbal, which is sexually suggestive objects or pictures, suggestive or insulting sound, physical exposure, leering, whistling, or obscene gestures. And one form of sexual harassment that could be also considered nonverbal is those little email forwards with those risque jokes that go around. That could be a form of nonverbal sexual harassment, something you need to keep in mind before you decide to forward that to your coworkers. The final form of sexual harassment is the physical, and that includes unwanted physical contact such as touching, rubbing, pinching, brushing the body, assaulting or coercing sexual intercourse. Most incidents of sexual harassment tend to be implied rather than verbalized or directly acted out. You're not going to often have an incident where someone comes up and rapes you in the office. That's not what happens most of the time for sexual harassment. But sometimes people can make jokes and innuendos, and that implication is there. Also, most of what courts consider in addressing issues related to sexual harassment is the victim's perception of the events. And that's important to keep in mind, because I always like to say that there is 3 sides to every story. The first person's side, the second person's side, and the truth. So that may be the case, but the courts are going to be looking at how the victim felt, what their perceptions of it were. And so you want to make sure that you're thinking not just from your personal perspective, but also considering what you're doing and what you're saying and what you may be portraying are affecting other people. Okay, more sexual harassment facts. Sexual harassment is an inappropriate use of power and authority, okay? And gender is not an issue. Not an issue. Sexual harassment can victimize both men and women in the workplace, and it can occur when the harasser and the victim are the same sex, even if neither party is attracted to members of the other gender. As I was describing earlier, the incident with my sister and her coworker, neither of them are attracted to the same gender, but one is obviously sexually harassing the other by sharing those stories. So it's important to keep in mind that there are lots of different types of sexual harassment, and that it can occur with both men and women. A third-party complaint regarding an incident found to be offensive or that is believed to create a hostile work environment can be the basis for a sexual harassment complaint. And sexual harassment policies apply to contractors and non-employees as well. I think sometimes we think that that it only applies to the people that are directly under our supervision. But if you have the UPS man coming in and he's making sexual comments to your secretary every day, that's not appropriate and needs to be dealt with as well. Employees that have frequent contact with client and vendor employees should be aware that the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission attaches employer liability for the acts the non-employees make toward their employees if the employer is made aware of the situation and fails to take corrective measures. So like I was saying, if that UPS man is coming in and harassing the secretary at the front desk or the receptionist, you need to take care of that. Not to say that all that UPS men are sexual harassers or that they're all men even, but it's something to keep in mind. What I think is the most important is that no means no. It never means yes. It never means maybe. So if someone tells you no, then it should stop right then and right there. Okay, we're going to take a few moments to do some scenarios. Before we do that, I want everybody to stand up and stretch. We've been sitting here for a few minutes listening to me talk. Been kind of a quiet group, so if everybody will go ahead and stand up, take a moment, stretch. Okay. Right? Now let's sit back down and go through these scenarios. Okay, this first scenario involves two women and a man, okay? Two women worked in the same office and had totally different moral values. One man continually harassed both verbally and physically the woman with rigid morals. The other woman laughed and joined in at times. This only served to make the harassee feel like she was making a big deal out of nothing. The other woman kept chiding the harassed woman for being prudish. The harassed woman did nothing to bring the situation to the attention of her supervisor, and until it was so far advanced that she'd suffered unnecessarily. By the time the supervisor was aware of the situation, the harasser had already made plans to change jobs and paid no attention to counseling. The harasser transferred jobs. Once he did, the harassed woman learned that she had not been the only victim of this man. This only served to make her angry with herself for not speaking up sooner and revealing this man's behavior, therefore preventing him from doing the same thing to other women at his next job. This incident took place before the harassed woman had any type of sexual harassment awareness training. How could this situation have been handled differently? Some ways. Let's see if we can get some responses. I think I see a hand over here. Okay. Johnny said lack of action by the harassee made the problem worse, and that's very true. If she'd reported it sooner, maybe things could have turned out a bit differently. Okay, I think I saw a hand over here. Becky? That's right, there was no support from the coworker. She was kind of being sexually harassed by two people, not just the man doing it, but by the coworker who joined in. So that's a good point. All right. And Beth. The harasser had been harassing other women. That's very true. So this wasn't just one incident. It was kind of a pattern. All right, those were some very good comments. We're going to go on to the second scenario. Okay, the second scenario involves a supervisor and a subordinate. Okay, a female employee complained to the unit manager that her supervisor kept rubbing up against her and coming up behind her to massage her neck and shoulders. When she told her supervisor to quit, he told her that a few more times and she would be warmed up. The manager didn't really think that this was very serious and tried to joke with her about her frigidity. He agreed to talk to the supervisor. The supervisor claims that he was told to keep his hands off state property, at least if he was going to get caught. The harassee turned into the butt of many jokes. The harasser started the same behavior with someone else. The manager thought the problem was solved because the original complainant didn't complain again. The supervisor and the manager were old friends. This all surfaced later when another complaint was received by a different manager and discussed at a staff meeting. How could this situation have been handled differently? Some other things that I think come to mind are that the manager didn't take the complaint seriously, and that was very unfortunate. It also got spread around the department, so she became the butt of jokes. So that kind of shows a kind of culture of non-compliance. The manager and the supervisor were not knowledgeable about their responsibilities in dealing with sexual harassment. They obviously opened up this company for a lawsuit and other issues, so it's not something we want to do. Okay, we're going to go on to objective 3 now, if no one has any other comments or questions. And we're going to explain the procedures for reporting sexual harassment incidents. Okay, reporting sexual harassment procedures. It's important for the victim of sexual harassment to inform the person harassing them that their conduct is unwelcome and to stop the behavior now. Back to that incident I shared earlier with my sister and her coworker. If my sister doesn't let her coworker know that she's uncomfortable with those stories, then that coworker probably has no idea that she is sexually harassing anyone. So it's important that you take the time to let them know. Also, employees who believe they are victims of sexual harassment in any form are to immediately report the incident to their supervisor. Okay? So, first of all, let the harasser know that their attentions are unwelcome. Second of all, make sure you report the incident to your supervisor. Now, for some more information, if the concern involves someone in the employee's direct line of supervision, so if it's your supervisor that's being affected, or you're uncomfortable for any reason, or not satisfied with the results that you get from your supervisor, please report that to the Corporate Human Resources Department, and they can take appropriate action. Okay? So just remember that you don't just have one line of communication. There are always multiple options available, and an ineffective respondent at one level does not preclude success at another level. So if you talk to your supervisor and you don't feel the situation is being handled, please report it to their supervisor or to Corporate Human Resources so that we can get this taken care of. As I said earlier, this company has a zero tolerance policy for sexual harassment, and we definitely want those issues to be taken care of. Okay. Next, we're going to talk about retaliation, which is one of the unfortunate things that can sometimes happen. Retaliation occurs when one person seeks revenge against another for exercising his or her right to complain about sexual harassment, and it's strictly prohibited. If you think back to that second scenario where the harassed woman became the butt of jokes, that's a form of retaliation, and that is strictly prohibited in this company. We do not allow that to happen. If an employee who participates in an investigation about sexual harassment believes that he's the subject of retaliation, he should immediately report the retaliation to the appropriate level of management or to Corporate Human Resources. Even if there's no action or discipline that you know of taken against the sexual harassment complaint, if you feel like you're being retaliated against, that's still something you need to report, because that is not tolerated. Before we go on to management's responsibility, I want to take a moment to discuss what sometimes there are reasons why people hesitate to report sexual harassment. I'm going to give you guys a moment to think. See some hands. Okay. Okay, those were all some great ideas. Some other ideas are that sometimes I think we're told That's just the way boys are. Boys will be boys, and that's not the case. Sometimes people don't want to get the sexual harasser in trouble. But as we saw in that first scenario, if someone is sexually harassing you, then they're probably not doing it just to you, and you want to get them the help that they need so that they can stop that behavior. And if they can't stop that behavior, then you don't necessarily want them in this work environment. And not that that's your decision, but you want to make sure that this is a positive work environment. Okay? Other reasons why our recipients of sexual harassment may be embarrassed by it and don't want to talk about it with anyone. They may be afraid of being blamed or the subject of ridicule. They are reluctant to talk to someone because no one seems to mind the harasser's behavior. They fear that if they talk about it, nothing will be done or the complaint will not be taken seriously. They fear reprisal from the harasser, which we talked about a minute ago, which was retaliation, especially if that person's the boss or representative of management. And that's one reason why there's the Corporate Human Resources Department, which is kind of outside some of the other management structures, to give you a safe place to go if you're being harassed. All right, so the next objective is to list management's responsibilities to prevent, recognize, and respond to sexual harassment. Okay, this is what supervisors need to do, okay? How many supervisors do I have in the room? Okay, got a couple. Supervisors must ensure that employees are aware of the company policies against harassment, okay? So any of your subordinates, you need to make sure when they start with the company, or even if they've been here a while, that they're aware of what the company's policies are. The next thing is that you need to be aware of occurrences of sexual harassment in the workplace within your area. Having an idea of what's going on in your department is pretty important. And part of that leads into the next point, which is to keep alert for signs of the impact of sexual harassment, such as poor morale, requests for transfer, and sudden undue tension in the workplace. Also, to prevent sexual harassment, supervisors should set the tone for their employees. Not only should they make sure their employees know what the policies are, but they should set the tone for their employees and act the way you expect your subordinates to act, okay? You should create an open environment so that if there's harassment going on, your subordinates feel that they can come to you and discuss them. And you want to help sensitize your employees to the problems surrounding sexual harassment, such as disruption of work and embarrassment suffered by coworkers. The next thing we're going to talk about is how you should handle a sexual harassment complaint. First of all, you should take the report seriously. It doesn't matter who's making it. If you're receiving that complaint, you need to take it seriously. Ask for details, okay? Listen, sympathize, but don't judge, okay? And it's important not to judge for either side, either for the complainant or the harasser, okay? You need to act immediately. Don't say, oh, well, I'll take care of that next week after we get this big project done. It needs to be, you need to get right on it. They need to see that you're acting on it. You need to respond to the concern. You might go back and share with the person making the complaint, you know, kind of what you found out or how you're going to handle it. If you can, sometimes you can't. But keep in mind that all information is confidential. And it's important to document things. But again, keep that confidential. And then make sure, like we said, to follow up on that complaint. Okay? In that first scenario, we talked about how the supervisor thought that since the complainant didn't come back, that it had been resolved. But if you get a complaint, you want to take some time later on to just follow up and make sure that everything is going okay. It's another way of making sure that retaliation isn't occurring. It's important to keep in mind that the employer is automatically liable for sexual harassment by a supervisor. However, the employer is only liable for actionable sexual harassment by a non-supervisor if it knew or should have known of the harassment and failed to take prompt measures to bring it to an end. And that's one reason why I said follow up immediately, because the courts are going to want to see that you didn't put it off, that you did address it quickly. Now, we're going to talk about the fifth objective, which is employees' responsibilities. We're going to identify what employees' responsibilities are, because it can't be all managers, okay? First of all, employees must refrain from making suggestive remarks, comments, sending inappropriate emails, or posting explicit pictures, okay? You have a responsibility there too. Second of all, you need to be aware of the occurrence of sexual harassment in the workplace. And you also need to be aware of what constitutes sexual harassment. That's one reason why you're here today, to learn what constitutes sexual harassment, which you should be able to do by the end of this presentation. And you should be familiar with organizational policies on sexual harassment, and we went over those earlier as well. And immediately report sexual harassment to management. Another thing that we talked about earlier was if you feel you're being harassed, you need to let the harasser know, again, that you feel their actions or their words or whatever are inappropriate. Okay, we're now to the summary portion. So you can tell we're getting close to the end. I hope you all been making your notes and ready to take that quiz. Sexual harassment is strictly prohibited in the workplace. We have policies established here about coworkers and supervisors, as well as clients and customers. We have reporting procedures for complaints. You should report to your supervisor, or you should report to corporate human resources. And violations may be ground for termination, because again, we have a zero tolerance policy in this company. Every employee shares responsibility for ensuring that the workplace is free from all forms of sexual harassment, and supervisors must ensure that every complaint is promptly, fairly, and appropriately investigated. Okay, so we're going to recap our objectives. First objective was to define sexual harassment. Hopefully you can be able to do that now. It's unwanted physical, verbal, or nonverbal contact of a sexual nature. You should be able to identify types and examples of sexual harassment. You should be able to explain the procedures for reporting sexual harassment incident. You should be able to identify management's responsibilities to prevent, recognize, and respond to sexual harassment. And you should be able to identify employees' responsibilities to prevent, recognize, and respond to sexual harassment. Does anyone have any questions or comments for me? You all have been great to participate today. I really appreciate that. If you'll please complete your post-test now, and after that, complete the evaluation of the presenter. I thank you for your time and attention, and I hope you have a great rest of the day.